Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the haunting photograph of a woman who was buried in 1908, yet appeared at her sister's wedding 4 years later. That you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The pursuit of history is often a negotiation with ghosts, a careful sifting through the dust of forgotten lives, seeking clarity in the fading ink of official records. These records are, by their nature, instruments of fact, forged in the cold, impartial fires of bureaucracy. They exist to anchor a life to a specific time and place, to draw a firm, final line between what was and what is. They leave no room for poetry, no space for ambiguity. They are the architecture of accepted reality. Consider one such artifact a death certificate issued by the authority of Millbrook County, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The paper itself, now a delicate, brittle leaf the color of old ivory, still carries the faint, acidic scent of its century-old pulp. The text, written in the precise, elegant cursive of a man accustomed to documenting life's most profound moments, is stark and unyielding. It speaks of a morning in October of 1908, a morning that arrived under a sky the color of slate, heavy with the promise of a long and bitter winter to come. On this morning, Dr. Edmund Harwick, a man whose hands had brought half the town's children into the world, was summoned to the grand Whitfield mansion on Elm Street. He had known this house in times of celebration, its windows ablaze with light, its halls echoing with music. But on this day, a chilling silence clung to the ornate architecture. He was led upstairs not by a cheerful servant, but by a somber, red-eyed Charles Whitfield, a man whose formidable presence in the world of commerce had been reduced to that of a shattered father. In an upstairs bedroom, a room filled with the delicate furniture of a young woman's life, lay the still form of Eleanor Margaret Whitfield. She was 23 years old. Dr. Harwick, a man of science and pragmatism, performed his duty with a heavy heart. He noted the waxy pallor of her skin, the unnatural stillness of her chest, the faint, sweet, and altogether terrifying odor of the disease that had consumed her from within. Consumption, the White Plague, was a familiar visitor in those years, a specter that paid no mind to wealth or status. In his medical bag, Dr. Harwick carried his journal, and in it, he had documented Eleanor's slow, graceful decline for nearly 2 years. He had prescribed rest, mountain air, and the fashionable mineral waters of the day. All the while, knowing these were but feeble gestures against a relentless, internal fire. Now, the fire was out. He took his fountain pen, its nib scratching softly against the official document, and filled in the requisite boxes. Name Eleanor Margaret Whitfield. Age 23. Cause of death, phthisis pulmonalis consumption. He signed his name with a steady hand, the looping signature a definitive, final act. The document was stamped, sealed, and sent to the town clerk, a man named Silas Croft. Silas Croft, in his dusty office at the town hall, received the certificate with a solemn nod. He, like everyone in Millbrook, had known of the Whitfield girl's long illness. He transcribed the information from the doctor's certificate into the great leather-bound town ledger, his own careful script joining the long, silent chorus of births, marriages, and deaths that constituted the official memory of their community. With that final entry, the existence of Eleanor Whitfield was formally concluded. Her story, as far as the world was concerned, was over. A second document corroborates the first. It is not a certificate, but a ledger entry from Hillcrest Cemetery, a place of quiet, manicured grief on a gentle slope overlooking the Connecticut River. The entry for October 29th, 1908 is simple. Whitfield, Eleanor M. Plot 17, Section C. The funeral had been a somber town affair. The great textile mill fell silent for a day, its looms standing like sleeping giants. The procession of carriages to the cemetery was long, a black ribbon winding through the autumn landscape. The town watched as the polished mahogany casket was lowered into the cold, dark earth. They saw Margaret Whitfield, hidden behind a thick black veil, supported by her husband. They saw a young Catherine, barely 16, her face a mask of pale, uncomprehending sorrow. The sound of shovels scraping against earth was the final, percussive punctuation to the tragedy. The granite headstone, erected a month later, carved her name and dates into stone, a permanent testament to her life and its end. These papers, these records, this carved stone, these were meant to be the final words in the story of her life. They were the anchors of fact, the bulwarks against impossibility. And yet, 4 years after that tombstone was set, 4 years after the earth settled over her grave, Eleanor appears again. The evidence for this second life, this impossible encore, is also a historical artifact. It is not a ledger or a stone, but an image captured in silver gelatin on a bright cloudless June afternoon in 1912. It is a formal wedding photograph, a testament to a day designed to banish the very shadows of the past. Let us step into the present for a moment, into the climate-controlled archives of the Millbrook Historical Society. Here, the photograph lies, not in an album, but in an acid-free archival box. To hold it is to feel the weight of its mystery. The cardboard mount is thick and beveled, bearing the embossed seal of the photographer S. Hartwell, Hartford. The image itself is a masterpiece of early 20th century portraiture. The tones are rich, ranging from deep, velvety blacks to delicate, paper white highlights. The composition is flawless. Let us examine it closely, as so many have before. At the center stand the bride and groom, Catherine Whitfield and Thomas Aldrich, their youth and happiness the intended focal point of the image. Surrounding them are their families, the pillars of two communities, their expressions a mixture of pride and formal solemnity. There are 20 people in total, 20 souls who gathered on the steps of the Whitfield mansion to celebrate the promise of the future. Their clothing, their hairstyles, their very postures are a perfect snapshot of the Edwardian era, an age of confidence and unshakable belief in a rational, ordered world. The image is sharp, the details precise. One can count the pearls on Mrs. Aldrich's necklace. See the delicate lace on Catherine's wedding veil. Now, let your eyes drift from the center. Move past the smiling faces, past the proud parents, to the far right of the group. There, partially cloaked in the deep, stark shadow of a grand Ionic pillar, stands another figure, a 21st figure. At first, she seems merely a part of the composition, another guest. But look closer. Her presence is different. While the others are rigid, holding their breath for the long exposure, she seems more relaxed, almost ethereal. She is a young woman, slender and graceful. Her hair is arranged in the elegant pompadour that was the height of fashion in 1908, but was already beginning to look dated by 1912. She wears a high-collared lace dress, a garment of exquisite detail. But it is not a wedding guest's attire. It is Sunday best, from a few years prior. And then there is her face. It is partially in shadow, but the light catches the curve of her cheek, the line of her jaw, and her lips, which are curved into a subtle, knowing, and profoundly enigmatic smile. Her eyes, bright and impossibly clear, are not looking towards the photographer as the others are. They seem to be looking directly forward, through the lens, through the camera, through time itself, as if meeting our own gaze from across a century. This is not a ghost story spun from tavern tales or late-night whispers around a dying fire. The figure is not a translucent spectre or a smoky apparition. She is solid. She casts a shadow. She occupies space. And yet, she is, according to the unassailable records of the town of Millbrook, 4 years dead and buried in plot 17 of Hillcrest Cemetery. This is not a simple tale of a photographic anomaly, a double exposure, or a clever, if cruel, hoax. The history of this single image is a history of intense scrutiny. It has been examined by photographers, by scientists, by detectives, and by scholars. Its every millimeter has been mapped, its chemical composition analyzed, its origins meticulously investigated, and through it all, it has held its secret fast. It presents us with a terrifying paradox, two sets of unimpeachable historical records, one of paper and stone, the other of silver and light, and they are in absolute, direct contradiction. One must be false, yet the evidence insists that both are true. What follows, then, is not an attempt to frighten, but an attempt to understand. It is an investigation into a moment when the firmament of reality seemed to crack, when the established laws of nature were suspended for the fraction of a second it took for a camera's shutter to open and close. It is the story of a family forced to confront the possibility that the bonds of love are stronger than the finality of death, and of a world forced to reckon with a small piece of cardboard that quietly and persistently insists that the dead are not always gone. We must ask ourselves, how could a fact, sealed in a grave, be undone by a trick of light and silver? Or was it not a trick, but a different, more profound kind of truth, captured for a fleeting moment? A truth that whispers from the past that the veil between worlds is far thinner than we dare to believe. The 15th of June, 1912 dawned bright and painfully clear. The sky a vast, unblemished sheet of cerulean blue. In the gardens of the Whitfield estate, the very air seemed to shimmer with a nervous energy, thick with the heady perfume of heirloom roses and freshly cut grass. It was a sweetness that felt almost like a deliberate performance against the family's long-held sorrow. Guests arrived in polished motor cars that gleamed in the sun and horse-drawn carriages that crunched softly on the gravel drive. Their fine clothes a vibrant tapestry of summer silks and crisp linens. For the first time in 4 years, genuine music, the hopeful, soaring notes of a string quartet playing a Viennese waltz, drifted from the mansion's open windows. To many, it was a sound so long absent it felt both foreign and miraculous. Catherine, a vision in white silk and heirloom lace, moved through the day with a focused, almost brittle grace, her smile unwavering. Amidst the congratulations and champagne, she felt a brief, sharp pang of absence, a phantom sensation of a missing hand on her arm, a shared smile that wasn't there. It was a fleeting shadow, quickly pushed away. This day was for the living. It was a flawless exercise in manufactured joy, a desperate and beautiful attempt to prove that life could, and would, go on. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began its descent, casting long golden shadows across the lawn, the moment for the formal portrait arrived. A man named Samuel Hartwell, a photographer of considerable renown from Hartford, directed the affair with the quiet authority of an artist orchestrating his masterpiece. His large format camera, a formidable apparatus of polished mahogany and gleaming brass, stood on a sturdy tripod like a silent, unblinking arbiter of memory. He arranged the 20 members of the wedding party with painstaking precision. A slight adjustment of a shoulder here, a tilt of a head there, as Hartwell ducked beneath the heavy black focusing cloth. The vibrant world dissolved into an inverted, ethereal image on the ground glass. He saw only light and shadow, form and texture. To his professional eye, it was a perfect composition, a prominent family at a moment of triumph. Their faces composed, their posture held perfectly still for the several seconds the exposure would require. There was nothing amiss. With a final check, he uncapped the lens, and the world was flooded by the brilliant, silent detonation of magnesium flash powder, a burst of artificial sun that momentarily bleached the scene of all color and shadow. 3 times this ritual was performed. By evening, he presented the developed glass plates to the family. They were, by all accounts, flawless. In the weeks that followed, a fragile, hopeful sense of normalcy began to return to the Whitfield home. The wedding had, it seemed, worked its magic. The oppressive silence that had been a member of the family for 4 years was replaced by the quiet hum of a household looking toward the future. It was during one tranquil afternoon in late July that Catherine sat down in the library to complete the final ritual of her wedding, arranging the official photographs in the grand, leather-bound family album. The room was quiet, save for the steady ticking of a Biedermeier mantel clock and the gentle rustle of the thick, cardstock pages. She worked slowly, carefully applying the tiny gummed photo corners, her heart filled with a quiet satisfaction as she preserved the joyful images. The first 2 prints were perfect captures of the day, but as she picked up the third and final print, her hand froze mid-air. Her gaze, meant to be scanning the whole group, was inexplicably drawn to the far right of the image, to the deep, inky shadow cast by the porch pillar. At first, it was merely an anomaly, a shape the mind couldn't immediately process. Her brain, conditioned by years of loss, tried to rationalize it a trick of the light, a flaw in the developing process, a guest half hidden. But her eyes refused to be deceived. She leaned closer, the scent of the book's leather filling her senses, her breath catching in her throat. It was not a shape, it was a figure, a woman wearing the high-collared lace dress Eleanor had worn to Easter service in 1907. A woman whose hair was swept up in a style that had gone out of fashion but was intimately, painfully familiar. And then she saw the face. It was partially obscured, yet the curve of the smile, a subtle, almost melancholy expression unique to her sister, was as clear as a fingerprint. A cellular, bone-deep coldness, sharp and absolute, washed over her. It was a coldness that had nothing to do with the summer air outside. The other figures in the photograph seemed to blur, their frozen smiles becoming meaningless masks. Only the woman in the shadow remained in focus. With a choked gasp, Catherine slammed the heavy album shut, the loud thud echoing the sudden, violent hammering of her own heart. She pushed it away, her body recoiling as if the object itself were radioactive, the source of the impossible vision it contained. For 3 days, the album remained a sarcophagus of leather and card, lying dormant on the library table. For 3 days. Catherine existed in a state of suspended terror, haunted by a question she dared not voice. Was she losing her mind? She remembered the doctor's whispers about Eleanor's nervous condition, her female hysteria. Was it a sickness of the blood? a madness that had lain dormant in her, only to be awakened by the emotional upheaval of the wedding. The fear was not just that she had seen a ghost, it was that she was the only one who had. A solitary witness to a shattered reality. A secret that would brand her as insane. On the fourth day, she could bear the agonizing uncertainty no longer. With a resolve born of desperation, she walked back into the library. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, silent witnesses. Her hand trembled as she reached for the album. She opened it to the page, and there she was, unchanged, undeniable. The figure in the shadow had not vanished. It had not been a hallucination. The truth, in all its terrifying, logic-defying finality, settled upon Catherine. This was real. Her mind reeling. She carried the photograph up the grand staircase to her mother's chambers. Margaret Whitfield, frail and ethereal, was sitting by the window. She looked up, a faint, tired smile on her face as her daughter entered. Catherine, unable to form words, simply held out the photograph. Margaret took it, her eyes scanning the happy faces. A flicker of warmth crossed her face, and then her gaze drifted to the edge of the frame. Her back went rigid. Her teacup rattled in its saucer. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a waxy, translucent pallor. A sharp, strangled gasp escaped her lips, a sound of pure, visceral shock that seemed to tear through the room's quiet. She whispered a single name, a breath of disbelief and agony. Eleanor. And then her eyes rolled back in her head, and she slumped sideways in her armchair, a fragile doll whose strings had been cut. The photograph fluttered from her limp fingers, landing face up on the Persian rug. The chaos that followed brought Dr. Harwick rushing to the mansion after tending to Margaret. He was quietly led to the study by a pale but resolute Catherine and a distraught father. As a man of science, Harwick's first instinct was one of gentle clinical dismissal. He expected a simple case of overwrought nerves, of grief manifesting as illusion. But when he was handed the photograph, his professional demeanor faltered. He retrieved a powerful magnifying glass from his medical bag and began his examination, his expression a mask of concentration. He studied the paper stock, the chemical composition of the silver nitrate image, the infinitesimal grain of the print. He meticulously traced the edges of the figures, searching for the telltale signs of a composite image, a clumsy superimposition. He found none. The image was seamless. He measured the angles of the shadows, noting with a growing sense of unease that the light falling on the impossible figure was perfectly consistent with the afternoon sun. He spent nearly an hour with the print, his initial confidence slowly dissolving into a profound, unsettling bewilderment. He finally looked up at Catherine and Charles, the magnifying glass held loosely in his hand, his voice low and heavy. "There is no evidence of trickery here," he confessed, the words tasting like failure in his mouth. "By all the laws of optics and chemistry that I know, this photograph should not exist. An impossible secret cannot be contained. It seeps out, like smoke under a door, carried on whispers, in concerned glances, through the invisible channels of a small, interconnected town." The story of the Whitfield photograph did not erupt into Millbrook. It bled into it. A housemaid, having overheard the doctor's baffled confession, spoke in hushed tones to her sister during her weekly shopping at the Mercantile. The words exchanged over a barrel of pickles. A distraught Charles Whitfield, seeking solace, confided in his brother, who in turn shared his astonishment with his wife at their evening meal. Within a fortnight, the photograph was no longer a private, familial horror. It was a public phenomenon. The news transformed the Whitfield mansion overnight. It ceased to be the respected home of the town's leading family and became an object of intense, morbid curiosity. Townspeople found new reasons to stroll down Elm Street, their gazes lingering on the front steps where the impossible had occurred. The story fractured the town's placid consensus. At the general store and the post office, fervent debates took place. The town pastor spoke guardedly of wonders beyond mortal understanding, while the more pragmatic businessmen at the bank scoffed at it as Whitfield's folly, a sad delusion born of tragedy. It became the town's central obsession, a mystery that overshadowed commerce and politics. The Whitfields, already isolated by their grief, now found themselves trapped in a new kind of prison, besieged by the very community they had once led, the unwilling custodians of a chilling artifact that was rapidly becoming the most famous and most feared object in the entire state. As the whispers and wild speculations surrounding the Whitfield estate swelled into a constant, suffocating roar of public intrusion, Charles Whitfield knew that the family's passive endurance had reached its breaking point. His daughter's wedding, intended as a defiant symbol of life's renewal, had instead become the genesis of a waking nightmare that held them all captive. Driven by a desperate, primal need to reclaim control over his family's sanity, their hallowed reputation, and the very fabric of reality itself, he initiated a series of formal inquiries. He was determined to either expose a monstrously cruel hoax or to finally confront an unthinkable, soul-shattering truth. The first official summons was sent via telegraph to Hartford, addressed to the photographer, Samuel Hartwell. The man arrived on the morning train with palpable reluctance, his professional pride wounded, his mind already formulating strenuous defenses against accusations of incompetence or, worse, outright fraud. He was ushered into the same grand library where Catherine had made her discovery, a room that now felt less like a sanctuary of knowledge and more like the epicenter of a bewildering psychic disturbance. Presented with his own work under the strained, watchful eyes of the Whitfield family, Hartwell's carefully constructed defensiveness quickly crumbled into the same state of stunned, helpless disbelief that had claimed Dr. Harwick. He spent hours with the photograph, using a jeweler's loupe, a tool of his trade, to scrutinize the silver particles, the albumin of the paper fibers, the very soul of the image he had created. He cross-referenced the print with the surviving glass plate negative, searching for any sign of post-development manipulation, any microscopic fissure or shadow that would suggest a composite image. There was nothing. In a signed and notarized affidavit, a document which still resides, crisp and yellowed, in the Millbrook Historical Society archives, Hartwell swore on his professional reputation and under oath that no other person was present during the exposure, that his equipment had functioned perfectly, and that the image was, in his expert opinion, an unblemished and scientifically accurate record of the light that fell upon his lens on that June afternoon. His testimony, intended to be a definitive exoneration of his craft, instead became the first official, unassailable stone laid in the foundation of the photograph's authenticity. With technical fraud now seeming an impossibility, Charles Whitfield took a more drastic and costly step. He retained the services of a private investigator from Boston, a man named William Morrison. Morrison was not a common detective who dealt in mundane crimes of passion or finance. His reputation among New England's elite was built on handling the unusual, He was a discreet problem solver, a man who navigated scandals, secrets, and the sometimes bizarre troubles of the wealthy with a quiet, methodical precision. Morrison arrived in Millbrook not with assumptions, but with a blank ledger and a relentlessly observant eye. For 2 weeks, he immersed himself in the town's life and the Whitfields' history. He interviewed every single guest who had attended the wedding. His questions gentle but disarmingly probing. His notes copious and exact. He spent a cold, windswept autumn morning in Hillcrest Cemetery, not only verifying that Eleanor's grave had never been disturbed, but also taking soil samples from around the granite marker. He conducted lengthy interviews with the undertaker and the grizzled groundskeeper, James Murphy. It was Murphy who admitted, with the reluctance of a man who distrusts his own senses, to an occasional, unnerving feeling of being watched near the Whitfield plot. He confessed, his voice low, to seeing what he had always dismissed as a trick of the morning mist, a fleeting, ethereal shape of a woman in white moving silently among the tombstones at dawn. Morrison's final report was a masterpiece of deductive reasoning, methodically dismantling every rational explanation. No itinerant cousin had been present. No townsperson bore Eleanor's likeness. No method of photographic fraud known to science in 1912 could have produced such a seamless and convincing image. His conclusion, delivered in a calm, even tone to a somber Charles Whitfield in that same library, was definitive. The photograph was genuine, unmanipulated, and impossible to explain through conventional means. Morrison's investigation, while comprehensive, still lacked a final, irrefutable human element that could anchor the spectral image to the deceased girl with absolute certainty. In his interviews, he learned of the one person who had been closer to Eleanor in her final days than anyone her private nurse. A woman named Dorothy Ashford. Having left the painful memories of Millbrook for a quieter life in Springfield, Massachusetts, after Eleanor's death, Mrs. Ashford was entirely unaware of the controversy that had engulfed the town. At Morrison's urgent request, she agreed to make the journey. She was an elderly woman of impeccable character and crystalline memory, stepping back into a chapter of her life she had long since closed. A tense, suffocating silence gripped the Whitfield parlor as she arrived. The key players, Catherine, her parents, a somber Dr. Harwick, and the observant Mr. Morrison were all present, forming a small, anxious tribunal waiting for its final witness. Mrs. Ashford was not told what she was there to see. She was simply handed the photograph. The room was so quiet that the ticking of the mantel clock seemed to hammer against the silence. The old nurse held the print in her gloved hands, adjusting her spectacles. Her eyes scanned the image. A faint, sad smile touching her lips as she recognized her former employers. Then her gaze found the figure in the shadow. There was no gasp of shock. There was no cry of disbelief. Instead, a look of profound, sorrowful recognition washed over her face. She nodded slowly, her expression one of immense sadness, not of fear. "Oh, my dear girl," she whispered, her voice thick with an ancient emotion. "Yes, that is my Eleanor. That is her soul's own smile." The confirmation, so gentle and so certain, sent an undeniable chill through the room. But the true, horrifying climax of the investigation was yet to come. It was Morrison who, after a respectful pause, pointed gently to the details of the figure's attire. "The necklace," he prompted, his voice low. "Can you tell us about the pearl necklace?" Dorothy Ashford leaned closer, her eyes narrowing to focus on the tiny, luminescent dots around the figure's neck. A long moment passed. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with a dawning horror that completely eclipsed her sorrow. Her hand rose involuntarily to her own throat. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of an absolute, graveside certainty that silenced every breath in the room. "That necklace," she began, her gaze locking with Charles Whitfield, whose face had gone deathly pale. "Sir, you purchased it for her 18th birthday, her favorite." She turned her gaze to Margaret. "On the morning of her burial," she continued, her voice trembling now. "Mrs. Whitfield, you asked me to perform one last service. You wanted her to look beautiful for her final rest." She paused, taking a ragged, painful breath. "I was the one. In the funeral home, just before they closed the casket, I was the one who fastened that pearl necklace around her neck." This was the moment the mystery transcended all logic, all hope of a rational explanation. It was not a confession of a human crime, but the unveiling of a truth far more terrifying. The apparition in the photograph was not just an echo of life. She was adorned with the very jewels she wore in her own coffin, 6 feet under the earth. The sheer weight of Dorothy Ashford's testimony shattered the boundaries of the Millbrook mystery. It could no longer be dismissed as a local affair, a tragic ghost story to be whispered about in a small New England town. Morrison's detailed report, now including the nurse's chilling, signed affidavit, found its way into academic circles in Boston and Cambridge. It soon landed on the desk of Dr. Marcus Whitman, a professor at Harvard University and a leading, if controversial, figure in the burgeoning field of psychical research. Intrigued by the case's distinct lack of sensationalism and the methodical nature of Morrison's investigation, Whitman traveled to Millbrook. He was not a credulous believer in spirits. He was a scientist, fascinated by anomalies that pricked at the edges of known physics. He subjected the photograph to the most advanced analysis available, studying it under powerful microscopes, analyzing the properties of the light and the subtle, almost imperceptible inconsistencies in the photographic emulsion. His findings, published in the 1913 volume of the Journal of Psychical Research, caused a minor sensation in the intellectual world. He noted, among other things, that the figure of Eleanor appeared slightly translucent when compared to the solid. Opaque figures around her, a detail invisible to the naked eye. He concluded that the case represented either an unprecedented example of a post-mortem psychokinetic manifestation or a level of photographic fraud so sophisticated as to be virtually impossible given the technology and circumstances involved. Dr. Whitman's paper elevated the photograph from a curiosity to a serious paranormal case file. The story crossed the Atlantic, attracting the attention of one of the most famous men in the world, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The creator of the hyper-rational Sherlock Holmes was, by this time, a passionate and public proponent of spiritualism. While he never traveled to Millbrook, his private correspondence confirms he was deeply engaged with the case, declaring it to be in a letter to a colleague. Among the most compelling pieces of evidence for the survival of the personality after death that I have yet encountered. His endorsement brought global attention to the small town, attracting a new wave of investigators and believers. The societal repercussion was now clear. The Whitfield wedding photograph no longer belonged to the family. It had become a legend, a core piece of evidence in the great ongoing debate between science and faith. Reason and the supernatural, a haunting, unanswerable question captured forever in a flash of summer light. The initial, feverish storm of international attention, with its deluge of letters from believers, telegrams from skeptics, and the unwanted pilgrimages of investigators, eventually receded. As all such tempests of public fascination inevitably do, the world, with its short memory, moved on to new wonders and new horrors. But for the Whitfield family, the storm never truly passed. It simply moved inward, collapsing the walls of their private life and becoming a permanent alteration of the psychological landscape. For them, there was no after. The photograph had caused a fundamental demolition not of their fortune or their social standing, but of their foundational understanding of the world. The solid, predictable reality governed by church sermons and bank ledgers had been irrevocably fractured, and they were left to live quietly within its ruins. The grand mansion on Elm Street, once a symbol of their mastery over the material world, was redefined. It became a quiet, self-imposed sanctuary, a fortress to protect themselves not from a ghost, but from the relentless curiosity of a world that could not and would not ever truly comprehend their new reality. Catherine Whitfield Aldrich lived for another 60 years after that fateful wedding day, a long and full life punctuated by the great upheavals of the 20th century. She raised children who grew into adults, celebrated golden anniversaries, mourned the passing of her parents and, in time, her husband, but not before celebrating his safe return from the inferno of the Great War to the outside world. She was the respected matriarch of the Aldrich family, a woman of quiet strength and unshakable composure. But within the private sanctuary of her own heart, she lived a life shared with a silent, loving companion. The impossible presence of a sister ceased to be a source of terror and was redefined over the decades as a profound, if inexplicable, source of comfort. In private letters discovered only after her death in 1972, she wrote not of a haunting, but of a presence. She described feeling Eleanor's calming influence during the difficult birth of her first son, a palpable sense of peace that filled the room and eased her fears. She wrote of quiet, one-sided conversations in the rose garden, sharing her joys and sorrows with the sister who was both gone and yet, somehow, undeniably, there. For Catherine, the photograph was not a chilling anomaly. It was the sacred, tangible proof of an unbroken bond, a testament to a love so powerful it had refused to acknowledge the finality of the grave. As generations turned, the photograph itself became a quiet, revered, and somewhat feared family heirloom, an artifact imbued with a power that seemed to transcend time. It was passed down to Catherine's granddaughter, Sarah, in 1972. Sarah was a woman of her time, practical, rational, a product of a scientific age with little patience for what she termed the ghost stories of her grandmother's generation. She inherited the photograph with a sense of familial duty, intending to store it away as a piece of ancestral history. But the artifact would not remain passive, placed on a mantle in a modern, minimalist home. The photograph seemed to exert a palpable influence, a subtle but persistent pressure on the atmosphere of the house. Sarah, a woman not given to flights of fancy, found herself inexplicably unsettled. She described a distinct, unnerving sensation of being watched whenever she was in the room. The feeling that Eleanor's enigmatic eyes were not fixed on a point in the distant past, but were actively, intelligently following her. Strange. Isolated drafts would chill the room, even with the windows sealed shut. After several months of escalating unease, Sarah found she could no longer bear to live under its gaze. In 1979, in an act of what she later described as psychological self-preservation, she donated the photograph, its original glass plate, negative, and all associated documents to the Millbrook Historical Society. The haunting legacy had finally been released from the family's private hands, becoming a public artifact, a permanent puzzle for the world to ponder. Its arrival in the public trust sparked a new wave of interest, this time armed with the dispassionate and powerful tools of modern science. In 1978, a team from the University of Connecticut's Photography and Materials Science Department conducted the most thorough forensic examination of the photograph to date. They subjected the original print and negative to technologies that would have seemed like black magic to Samuel Hartwell, under the cold, unwavering gaze of an electron microscope. The paper fibers and silver gelatin emulsion revealed no signs of disturbance, no layering, no composite work. Chemical analysis confirmed the print was a singular product of its era. Computer enhancement techniques, designed to reveal the slightest manipulation, only served to deepen the mystery, bringing into focus the fine, intricate details of the lace on Eleanor's dress and the subtle, lifelike expression in her eyes, details that would have been nearly impossible to fabricate with 1912 technology. But the most profound discovery came from spectral analysis. The data confirmed, with chilling scientific certainty, that the light reflecting from the image of Eleanor Whitfield was measurably different from that of every other figure in the photograph. Science, which had been called upon to finally provide a rational explanation, had instead provided empirical, documented evidence of its otherness. Over the decades, skeptics have, of course, proposed theories. For the human mind abhors a vacuum, especially one that is shaped like a ghost. They speak of an elaborate, technically brilliant hoax perpetrated by the family for reasons unknown, a theory that ignores the family's subsequent reclusiveness and genuine, lifelong distress. They suggest the presence of a forgotten, look-alike relative, a theory dismantled by William Morrison's exhaustive, contemporary interviews with every single wedding guest. They posit that the entire story is a folktale, a legend that grew over time, a theory that crumbles against the weight of the physical, unmanipulated photograph that still exists today, along with the detailed, sober reports from investigators and scientists of the era. None of these theories can adequately account for all the evidence, and none can withstand the final, chilling testimony of the nurse, Dorothy Ashford, and the irrefutable, horrifying matter of the buried pearl necklace. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Eleanor Whitfield's case is, in the end, its profound and aching ordinariness. This was not a séance in a darkened room. It was not a story born from the theatrics of a spiritualist medium. Eleanor was not a famous psychic, nor did she make any claims to supernatural abilities during her short, tragic life. This was a formal wedding photograph, taken in the bright, unfiltered, unforgiving light of a summer day by a respected professional in the presence of 20 witnesses, none of whom saw anything unusual. She was simply a young woman who died too soon, who loved her family with a fierce and gentle heart, and who, it seems, somehow found a way to be present at one of the most important moments in her sister's life. If the photograph is genuine, and every credible investigation from 1912 to the modern era suggests that it is, then it forces us to confront questions that lie at the very edge of human understanding. We are left looking at this impossible image, this portrait of a love that refused to die. And we must ask, what are the true laws that govern existence? Is the bond between two souls, forged in love and sealed by loss, a force as real and as powerful as gravity, capable of bending light and time? Can a moment of profound collective emotion, a family's desperate, unspoken wish for a lost loved one to be present at a joyous occasion, somehow imprint itself upon reality, upon a chemically treated glass plate? Or is photography itself a medium more mysterious than we know, capable of capturing not just a fraction of a second, but a tear in the very fabric of space-time, a fleeting glimpse into a world where the dead are not gone, but are simply waiting? The photograph offers no easy answers. It hangs today in a climate-controlled case, an object of quiet, immense power, a permanent challenge to our comfortable and fragile assumptions about the world. It stands as a silent, enduring warning that the universe is not obligated to make sense to us. And all it offers in return for our endless questions is the haunting, enigmatic smile of a young woman who was supposed to be gone forever, yet somehow, for one perfect June afternoon, found her way home